Hello, today I'm reviewing the Endgame Gear XM1r. Almost a year ago now, this mouse released to near universal acclaim. Many people, including myself, thought of it as the best wired mouse to date. And today, even after the market has progressed, I think the XM1r is still unmatched at providing a high quality experience for only $60. If you are a claw grip user who has somehow still not picked this mouse up, I want to try to convince you how good this mouse is in this video. This has been part of my main rotation for many months now, so I'm excited to get into a review of my old reliable for you guys today. Alright, let's get into it. To start it off, this mouse feels incredibly high quality. The plastic feels very premium and the build is flawless. There are absolutely no creaks, no flexes, and this feels like an absolute tank in hand. I think that currently only Vaxi and Zowie can compete with the XM1r's build quality. It is very good. The only actual issue I have is right here where the two shells meet on either side. These grooves are quite deep and very noticeable during a normal grip. I was able to get used to it pretty quickly and now I don't have any issues with it. But every now and then I will notice this ridge when I adjust my grip and I rub my hand up against it. It also collects dead skin cells very easily, so it just contributes to making the mouse look more dirty overall. Now, despite the plastic feeling so solid, this mouse only weighs in at about 70 grams without the cable. I would certainly prefer if they were able to shave off some weight, but I don't have any problems with 70 grams whatsoever. It feels very standard and very comfortable for me personally, and I feel that many others will be the same. Alright, now onto the clicks, which is probably what gets talked about the most on this mouse. The XM1r uses very well implemented Kale 8.0s. They are extremely tactile and chunky feeling clicks. If you want the most tactile feedback possible, these are what you're looking for right here. They feel incredibly responsive. Although this tactility does come at a price because these switches will be a little bit harder to actuate than most. This actuation force actually depends on where you click on the shell though. At the very top they feel significantly lighter than at the back. But regardless, no matter where you click it, these clicks will feel a little bit harder than most. Just be aware that if you are someone that likes to click way back here, they are going to feel very stiff. These main mouse buttons also have very little pre and post travel. This makes them feel extremely crisp and very snappy. There is almost no play on the buttons at all, and the only thing you really feel is the actual switch actuation itself and no other movement. If you want the most crisp and clear feeling click, then this mouse also has you covered. One pretty minor issue that I have with these is that there's a very large difference between the left and the right clicks. On the left click, the entirety of the tactile response is restricted to the actual button itself, and I don't feel any reverberation through the shell. But on the right click, the tactile response spreads throughout the entirety of the mouse and it feels much more chunky in comparison. Here's a sound test to help you get a better feel. Here's the left click. And now here's the right click. Left, right, left, right. The left is significantly more bassy and thalicky in comparison, and this difference is really noticeable. Now, I don't think this is an actual issue in game because what you use your right click for is very different than your left, but it is still very annoying nonetheless. So while I do think that these clicks are very good and a lot of people love them, they are still not my personal favorite and just not my style overall. Generally, I prefer clicks that are much lighter and feel softer with more post travel, like Vaxi for example. I just don't really personally like how it feels like the clicks hit a hard backing. I like when they're a little softer and a little more bouncy. But once again, if you don't like this bounciness, you just want a very crisp, very solid, extremely tactile click, then I think the XM1r is your best option and the best example of this style of click. Alright, now onto the cable, which is another amazing part about this mouse. I think that this is the perfect stock cable. It is highly flexible and I don't feel any sort of resistance when I'm making any sort of rotational movements. But the cable itself still isn't floppy at all. It still holds its shape somewhat and doesn't get in your way. Floppiness is the biggest issue on the new C-series mice from Zowie. These cables are more flexible than the XM1r, but almost too much so. I feel that they can end up flopping around and getting in the way if you don't have good proper cable management. The XM1r in comparison finds a much better balance between flexibility and floppiness. You don't need as good cable management with a cord that holds its shape just a little bit more. Another thing that it excels at is that it is very thin and light. You don't feel the cable moving around when you're making these fast movements. You don't end up feeling that same resistance and pull that you do at the end of very aggressive movements like you do on these much heavier, stiffer cables. The only actual issue that I have with the XM1r stock cable is that the stress relief isn't tilted up very much. It basically just comes straight out of the mouse and it creates a lot of drag on the pad. During normal use, this entire area of the cable here makes complete contact with the pad and rubs up against it very noticeably. I think if you have a better bungee solution than I do, which is literally just taping my cables to the back of my monitor, then I think that this will be less of an issue for you, but it is still the only thing that holds this mouse back for me personally. This cable drag can be very annoying sometimes. Once I'm able to get used to the drag and start annoying it, I don't actually ever feel it in game. It doesn't seem that the drag actually adds any friction, just a tiny bit of scratchiness. But really besides that, I think this is the perfect cable. Now of course an aftermarket cable will always be an improvement, but you still have a fantastic experience stock. This is still absolutely the best stock cable I've ever used and I will never replace it. Alright, now onto the coating, which is yet another highlight of this mouse. It feels very rubberized, much more so than other rubberized coatings. This makes it feel extremely grippy and sticky feeling in your hand. I really feel like the coating helps lock my grip in like no other mouse can, even when I start to get very sweaty. I could pretty easily say that this is the most grippy coating I've ever used. So much so in fact that it actually caused issues when I first got this mouse. I wasn't able to immediately find my grip with it, so as I was shifting my fingers around trying to find out how to hold this mouse best, the coating ended up hurting my fingers and almost causing calluses because of how much it would grip them when I tried to move. This coating seriously does not want your fingers to move, and it will make sure that they stay put. Although, one downside of having such a rubberized coating is that this picks up oils and fingerprints extremely easily. You could probably tell that all throughout the video, every time I touch the mouse, it ends up leaving a very noticeable mark. This coating picks up fingerprints and oils like no other I've ever seen. It looks extremely dirty no matter what you do, and you need to constantly clean it to maintain a nice pristine look. I actually had someone flame me in the comments for my XM1 looking so dirty when I was doing a shape comparison. And please, if you're still watching this, I tell you that you cannot fix that. It is not a result of my negligence, it is just how this mouse looks. Any sort of even light use will turn this mouse into an oily mess. And that is the only blemish on an otherwise stellar coating. Alright, now onto the scroll. I actually think the scroll wheel on this mouse is kind of weird. As you can see, it's very small and very forward placed on the mouse. It doesn't actually look that far forward on cam, but trust me, in person, it feels strangely close to the top of the mouse. I am still able to reach it, of course, and I don't think people have any issues with that, but it does just feel weird to have to straighten out my fingers so much to get to a scroll wheel. Then, as I said earlier, the scroll wheel itself is actually very small, so the arc length of each individual tactile bump will feel smaller than most wheels out there. These steps are still very well defined and tactile, but they happen very close together. And them being so close together actually creates a pretty smooth feeling on the scroll wheel. I think if you want a relatively smooth wheel that still retains some tactility, this will be a great option for you. It still isn't my personal preference because I prefer a much more tactile wheel, with larger, more chunky steps. Think of Vaxi, for example. But even though this wheel still isn't to my preferences, I still like using it, which I think is a testament to how good it is. Then as a final note, the middle click is pretty light. I've never accidentally middle clicked while scrolling, even my most vigorous bunny hopping. But I do think that if this middle click was any lighter, I would get a lot of accidental actuations. It feels like the amount of force acquired is just right on the edge of causing issues, which kind of makes it feel weird and just strangely light in my opinion. Alright, now on the side buttons, which I think is pretty easily the worst part about this mouse. I think they are actually fairly tactile and pretty crisp if you press them very lightly. But if you start to apply any force to them, you run into the most post travel I have ever experienced. It is truly impressive how much post travel are on these side buttons. I don't think I could design a mouse that goes into the shell this much. It is truly impressive how much post travel these buttons have. This makes them feel pretty mushy and very unsatisfying despite them being tactile at the very front end. This post travel seriously just ruins any sort of hopes that these side buttons had at being satisfying. And they also have a very strange design of having mouse 5 being so much smaller than mouse 4. At the very beginning, I would fat finger mouse 5 so much when I was just trying to press mouse 4 because of the difference between the button sizes. Now I'm fine and I don't do it so often, but it still does happen occasionally, and this is the only mouse that happens to me on. I would love to see if they cleaned up some of the post travel and moved them just a little bit farther back or just equalize the size. Alright, now onto the stock feet. Stock, the XM1r uses these white dyed PTFE feet, and I think they're actually pretty decent overall. Nothing revolutionary of course, but highly usable. And you actually have two options. When you first get the mouse, it comes with 4 feet in each corner. Normally the setup is pretty fine on most mice, but on the XM1r in particular, the stock feet actually aren't rounded. Therefore, having the more surface area on the inside of the feet ends up causing a lot more scratchiness. It will get better once you break them in and start to round them out yourselves, but I still will never recommend someone use the 4 small feet on any sort of rough pad. But then the cool thing Endgame did was include larger skates that look like the ones I have here. These stock larger skates feel much better on rough pads, and actually feel pretty solid once you break them in and round out the edges. I did eventually replace mine with Tiger Ice, and I do think that they feel much better than the stock options, but if I never had the option of upgrading the feet, I wouldn't have any issues. They are pretty solid overall. So all in all, the XM1r probably has the best stock experience that you can get on a mouse right now. It is extremely high quality in almost all facets, looking at you side buttons. It has a fantastic cable that absolutely does not need to be replaced, and the stock feet are pretty decent overall. Then on top of that, it is also pretty cheap at only $60. As I said previously, the only two companies that compete with this sort of quality is Vaxi and Zowie, which are both $5 and $10 more expensive respectively. But still, neither of those mice have as good of a stock experience as the XM1r. Zowie stock feet feel significantly better once replaced, and Vaxi cables aren't the greatest. It is so impressive what Endgame is able to offer for only $60 here. It is really just a no-brainer buy. Alright, now just on one final note, I want to talk about the software real quick. It is of course completely optional because all the controls are at the bottom of the mouse here with this one main button, but the thing that is really important to do is update the firmware. If you don't do this, a couple very major issues can occur. The first of which is that it can lose tracking when you do this type of tilt reset. Sometimes when you pick the mouse up on certain surfaces, it just completely loses tracking for a couple seconds when you set it down like this instead of straight. Then slam clicks also happen very often. I can physically hear the switches actuating just when I'm doing this right here. But of course, since I have the updated firmware, none of those clicks actually registered. So after you update, all these issues go away and you have a perfect experience. Alright, now onto the fun part, the shape. For reference here, my hand is 18 by 9 to 9.5 centimeters. The main design goal of this mouse is to create a shape with a very large, very tall hump and low buttons. This hump very aggressively curls and reaches its highest point in the back middle here. Then once it reaches this point, it very quickly slants off to create a pretty steep slope on the buttons. This steep slope is quite noticeable in gripping the mouse, and you will feel a difference between flatter mice. The hump also flares out pretty aggressively to create a very wide grip. It isn't very noticeable from this angle, but it is very obvious from the underside. Here you can pretty easily see the massive hump flare. This wide hump ends up feeling at your hand quite a lot. Instead of feeling like you have to wrap your hand around the mouse to get support, it feels like the XM1r forces itself into your hand and makes your grip very wide. This gives you a feeling of a very high amount of support because of how much contact it makes in these areas. It feels like it ends up forcing itself into adding more stability to your grip, because of how oppressively wide it feels. Then on top of that, the hump is even diamond shaped. This diamond shaped curvature helps it conform to this area of your hand very well. It is super easy to pull the XM1r back into your hand and have it fill out this entire area here. On mice that are much more rounded, it doesn't end up filling out this middle area of your hand right here quite as much. You can see that there's very little air gap here in my normal claw grip, as opposed to the GPX with a much more rounded top. Then especially to the S2 here with a flat top. Now once again, this diamond shape helps force the mouse into your hand and add additional support and stability. Additional stability was the most likely goal with this diamond shape, but I also do think that it assists with a tilt grip very much. You can see here when I pinch my hand and create this sort of taco shape, that I don't actually end up making a diamond shape when my wrist is completely flat, but when I rotate it. Therefore, I feel I can bring the same pinch feeling to gripping the back of the XM1r. Here I'm able to nestle the hump into this little shape I made earlier, very easily. And this can only occur because it is so diamond shaped. I can't quite get the same feeling of pinching the hump with my hand on any other mouse. It feels like the XM1r in particular excels at a tilted claw grip. So while I do really like this hump and I feel that the extra support it gives has a ton of stability, I do think that it is somewhat overbearing. It is so wide and so aggressive with its diamond curvature that it just feels like it forces its way into my hand. I don't have any other option than to just let it fill my entire hand. And sometimes, of course, that's a good thing, and if you do want maximum support and stability in your aim, I think the XM1r should be your go-to claw grip mouse. But I personally prefer a little bit more flexibility, and I feel that the XM1r restricts my range of motion too much for me to feel flexible with it. With a much less pronounced but still very noticeable hump overall giving me a much greater range of motion than the XM1r. I feel that my small inner hand finger motions are just way too neutered on a hump that is this wide, and it doesn't quite make up for it with its stability in my opinion. Alright, now on to the second thing which defines the shape, which is of course the very low button height. Now this is what I really like about the XM1r. As I said before, the XM1r's hump is still pretty high profile, yet has a very similar button height to what you'd normally find on a very low profile mouse like the FK2 here. This dichotomy between a high profile hump and low buttons feels excellent in my opinion. I feel that I can get my fingers very close to the pad without actually changing my wrist angle, because of how the hump meets my hand here and inhibits my wrist from getting down lower. On the FK2, for example, I still get that feeling of very precise low to the pad fingers, but the hump is so low and non-existent that my entire hand here also gets close to the pad. But then with the higher profile XM1r, my hand is able to pull away from the pad but my fingers still get close, and I greatly prefer this feeling to my entire hand and fingers all being close to the pad. This ends up making the mouse feel like more of a precision instrument to me personally. It feels like I'm using a pencil very aggressively where I'm still able to maintain this wrist angle, but still get that feeling of my fingers being close together. This type of aggressive, very tool-esque feeling ends up making microcorrections feel extremely precise on the XM1r. My finger motions feel so on point and so precise, it is incredible for me. This is easily what I like most about this mouse. These tiny little finger motions that I can get feel so good. Which really just makes it a shame that my range of motion is so restricted. I can't actually move my fingers that far, but the movements I'm able to get feel so good. This is what makes me really want an XM1 Mini. I feel that if they would be able to capture that same high-profile, low-button feeling, but in a package that is way less restrictive, this could very easily be my main mouse. Because what it does well, these small little inner hand motions feel so good. It's just held back by having a hump that feels so oppressive. Now, of course, again, if you do want the maximum support possible and you want all stability, then I think this hump will be perfect for you. Alright, now finally I want to talk about the side curvature for just a little bit. The sides of the XM1r feature some of the most aggressive curvature I've ever seen. Well, on a symmetrical mouse, of course. These grooves here on the thumb and finger side are very deep and give you an excellent feeling of support when you dig your fingers into them. It really feels like I can just lock my fingers in place, especially when the coating is so grippy like I talked about earlier. And also because the curve is so aggressive, this mouse can actually feel much thinner depending on where you grip it. If you go with all your fingers right across the sensor here, it's going to feel significantly thinner than if you grip it up top. This is why some people have some conflicting reports on the actual grip with the XM1r. Depending on how you grip it, it completely changes. Personally, I use something right in between these two extremes, where I mount my pinky right here on the edge of the flare, and then I place my ring finger right before its widest point. When you use something like this, the width is going to end up feeling pretty standard for its length. But of course, if you grip it across the sensor, it's going to feel pretty thin for its length, and then if you grip it up top, it's going to feel pretty wide for its length. It's all just going to depend on what's comfortable for you. Then in addition, the sides are also very concave. This makes the mouse much easier to pull up and back into your hand. You will certainly be able to feel how aggressively slanted these sides are. Alright, so now onto some shape comparisons of other hump-focused mice. First, I want to talk about the Burst Pro because I think that this is the best comparison to make and that these two are very similar shapes. They have almost identical designs and feel very similar in hand. The primary difference comes from pretty subtle changes in the hump. The Burst Pro is much more rounded and feels like the hump is more circular compared to the XM1's diamond shape, and it is also slightly wider. This makes it so that the Burst Pro feels like it fills your hand out more in this direction, as opposed to filling out the middle of your hand. You can see here that I just have slightly more breathing room than I do on the XM1. However, I still don't feel this extra room really contributing to my range of motion at all, and I still feel pretty similarly restricted as I do on the XM1 because of how wide it is. I think that the Burst Pro is really for people that still want the stability that you get from the XM1, but that don't want this middle portion of their hand to be filled as much. Also, the Burst Pro sides are almost completely flat as compared to the XM1's aggressive curves. This will give you much more freedom in where you place your fingers. I don't feel that I'm as quite locked in with my finger placement as I am on the XM1, but I know that a lot of people do really like these flat sides. I just feel like my fingers slide around a little bit too much to be comfortable, especially when you consider the less grippy coating. Alright, next I want to talk about the NP01. Because both of these mice feature very prominent humps that do their best to really fill out your hand as much as possible. The main difference, of course, will be that this hump is ergonomic, and you can really tell when you grip it. Instead of feeling like you have to pull the hump back into your hand in order to get that same amount of support as you do on the XM1, the NP01 fills out your hand much more naturally, and overall has a much more relaxed feel while still offering a pretty similar amount of support. Its higher buttons, and more curvy sides that create a very natural finger position, also contribute to the NP01 feeling much more relaxed in comparison, but still with a somewhat similar wide hump feel. If you're someone who liked the hand support that the NP01 provided, but you want something that feels more aggressive and precise, then I think the XM1 is going to be an excellent option for you. Alright, now on to the NP01S. This mouse goes in the opposite direction as the NP01. It has a very similar aggressive feel due to its low height in the front, but the NP01S feels even more aggressive because of how much thinner it is. Then of course it also has a hump that creates a similar, very tool-esque feeling that I talked about earlier with the XM1. However, the big difference is that this hump is significantly smaller. It feels much less bulky in comparison. I still feel like I have a great range of motion on the NP01S despite it being a very hump-focused mouse. But of course it does still feel way less stable because of how much less the hump contacts your hand. If you've already used the NP01S and you want something that feels a little bit fatter in the back, a little bit more stable, a little bit more locked in, then the XM1 can absolutely give that to you while still retaining the very aggressive grip feel. Alright, now finally onto the S2C. I think that these two mice do feel very different, and I'm really only comparing them because I think that they are the two top claw grip shapes out there. Of course, they both have a very similar design of a prominent hump and a lower front, but it ends up feeling like the XM1 just takes us to an extreme. The hump is noticeably taller and wider, and the buttons are also noticeably lower. It simply takes the design philosophy of the S2 and just stretches it to the extreme. This makes the S2 feel like it supports you a little bit less because the hump doesn't fill out your hand as much. So much less contact is made in this middle area here because of the flat, boxy hump. Now, of course, you are still able to get stability on the edges here, but it doesn't even compare to the XM1. Then, while the low front end of the XM1 makes it feel very aggressive, the higher S2C feels more natural in comparison. I feel that my grip is so much more calm and relaxed when I'm using this mouse as compared to the XM1. I don't feel like I'm forced to curl and squeeze my hand as much. Then the S2 also has much flatter sides in comparison. I feel that this allows you to create a much more flexible finger position all the way up and down the sides of this mouse. But if you do want something that can lock in your fingers just a little bit more, then the XM1's more aggressive curves can be what you're looking for. So while I do think that the XM1 excels in certain areas, like in how precise a very aggressive grip can feel with it, I do still think that the S2C is just the perfect claw shape. It is so much more neutral and balanced in comparison. You don't have to grip it as aggressively, the hump isn't as oppressive, and it doesn't force you into any one style. It is just so balanced and so good for almost anybody, I feel. I feel that this should be the go-to neutral claw grip shape, and the XM1 should be a more niche option if you just happen to like how it feels. Alright, thank y'all for watching. My next mouse review will be on the Outside AX, and my next pad actually won't be on the Vaxi PA that I have here. I was able to get a sample of the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn, so I will be getting out a review on that pretty soon. I hope to see you all in those ones.